Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, but before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers and every single click counts. And today's deck is going to be focused around Joe Grant. For 2 colorless and 1 white, it's a legendary creature, human soldier, 3/2, with each historic card in your hand has cycling 2 colorless and a white, and whenever you cycle a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Joe Grant. She's also a Doctor's Companion, but we're not going to be using that part of the card. So this has been an interesting one because I started off building a deck for Celestine the Living Saint, which is a commander that I've always had in my eye on, and the more I built that deck, the more I realized I was putting a lot of cycling cards in, and then I realized that Joe Grant existed, and I was completely shocked because I'd overlooked this card from Doctor Who, probably because there's so many amazing cards in the Doctor Who set, and it just seems like a really fun build around commander because you're doing something very different from lots of commander decks out there. What you want to be doing is playing a bunch of legendaries so that you can just dump them into the graveyard and then reanimate them for value. At the same time, you're also going to be playing a bit of a cycling package. So obviously we're running some great cycling payoffs that allow us to abuse creatures and blink them and get their abilities over and over. There's just a lot of cool different angles that we can take with this deck, and I'm kind of excited about it, honestly. I didn't think I'd be this excited about a mono white commander, but here we are. So without further ado, let's get started. And we're going to get started off with Alabaster Host Intercessor. This is a card that has plane cycling, which is great because it allows us to find our planes, particularly since we're running Emeria the Sky Ruin, which means we really want to hit our planes. One thing that you'll notice about this deck is that you're almost always going to have a play at every point in the curve because of all the cycling we're running, and I think that's really nice. You should very rarely end up with unused mana. Angel of the Ruins is another excellent card with plane cycling. This one is particularly good as well because it has a great ETB, and seeing as one of the main payoffs for cycling is something like Astral Slide, which allows you to blink creatures every time you cycle, this is going to be one of the best cards in the deck. Avacyn Angel of Hope is a great one to cycle into our graveyard and then reanimate, thus getting one of the most powerful effects in Commander. Boromir, Warden of the Tower, is a really nice one because it can put itself into the graveyard many times for our reanimate effects. It also gives us a way to protect against board wipes that can also be cycled away. We don't need it. Cathar Commando works well with all of the reanimation cards we're running, such as Revelock and the like, and it's just a very good piece of interaction. Celestine the Living Saint is a card that we're still running in the deck, even though we don't have that much lifelink. She does have lifelink on her own, but that should almost always be enough to get something back from the graveyard. Dauntless Dismantler is a new card from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan that is very good at dealing with treasures and just artifacts in general. Not only that, but it's amazingly good early game at blocking opposing creatures. 1/4 is actually very annoying to get through. Daxos, Blessed by the Sun, can gain us a little bit of life for stuff like Celestine. It's also a legendary, so it's very nice to discard it, and in a mono white deck it's going to have pretty big toughness, which again means it can block all day early game, which we obviously want in a deck that's slow like this. Drannith Healer is great because it can cycle itself for just 1 mana, but we can also just have it in play and then gain a bunch of life whenever we cycle, which works with our other cards. Eagles of the North is excellent just because it plane cycles for 1 mana. That means that we can always have something to do on turn 1 with this in hand. Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite, is another great one to dump into the graveyard and reanimate because it's a game-breaking effect. Emeria Shepherd is one of the best cards in a mono white deck. This can provide us with repeatable reanimation of stuff late game when we have a ton of planes in hand, which we have a lot of ways to search out. Eternal Dragon is a very old school card, but again it allows us to search up planes, which is something we definitely want to be doing in this deck, and we can just reanimate it later, or if we have a bunch of mana to sink into it, we can just get it back into our hand and get it started all over again. Flourishing Fox either cycles itself for very cheap or comes down early and gets bigger and bigger as the game goes on. It's also good that we can recur this with something like Revelock. Guardian Scale Lord is another good reanimation effect. This should almost always allow us to reanimate something the turn it comes down, and then later on it can do a decent Sun Titan impression of its own. Herald of the Forgotten is a very good finisher in this deck when we've just cycled through a bunch of cards and have a pretty full graveyard. Do bear in mind that it's only going to reanimate cards that actually have the word cycling printed on them. Imposing Vandasaur is another cheap cycler. That's basically the main reason we're running it. Karmic Guide reanimates something from our graveyard for fairly cheap, and then we can just let it hit the graveyard on its own and bring it back by other means. Knight of the White Orchid allows us to play catch up very nicely, particularly if someone is playing green at the table. Landscaper Golos basically plane cycles, which is very decent. Lauren of the Third Path hits almost every metric we want in this deck. It's a legendary, so we can cycle it away. It's cheap, so it can be reanimated by almost all of our cards, and it has an ETB effect that we can abuse with Astral Slide. Lauren, Disciple of History, can help us rebuy buy some artifacts from the graveyard. We actually have a couple of artifacts that we sacrifice as well, so this is pretty nice. Royal Retainers is great for reanimating some of our heavy hitters. This is a very powerful effect on a 3-mana card. Loyal Warhound is basically another version of Knight of the White Orchid, so we're totally for this. Moonblessed Cleric is great for searching up either Astral Drift or Astral Slide, which are two of the best cards in the deck. The Coven ability of Redemption Choir should almost always be active, and once it is, this is really solid. It immediately reanimates a permanent like Sun Titan, and then it does it every time it attacks as well, so that's very powerful. Remorseful Cleric is graveyard hate that we can recur. We definitely want stuff like this. Revelock is an amazing reanimation creature, but it's even better because it has a leaves the battlefield ability, which means that it's so abusable with Astral Drift and Astral Slide, and that's why we have a few cheap creatures that can sacrifice themselves, because we can just rebuy ETBs all day with this card in this deck. Rhea Dawnbringer is incredibly slow, but we are running a very slow deck, and this does provide a very powerful effect once we get to the late game. Selfless Spirit is another cheap creature that sacrifices itself and therefore is good to reanimate with something like Revelock. Skyclave Apparition is another good creature with a powerful ETB, which is great to Astral Drift or Astral Slide. Snare Tactician is a lot more powerful than it seems. Being able to tap stuff down at instant speed can often stop you from taking a lot of damage. You can even make some political deals with this card and say, if you attack someone else, I won't tap your creature down. Soaring Sandwing is another plane cycling card that also happens to gain us a nice little bit of life. Solemn Ramsus and its ETB can be abused with Astral Drift and Astral Slide to get us closer to Emeria. Splendor Mare is nice because it can provide a nice little life buffer by putting a lifelink counter on one of our creatures. Sun Titan is excellent in any reanimation based deck, and particularly good when we can blink it at instant speed to get the ETB again. Tesher Ancestor's Apostle should be triggering quite a bit in this deck. We're running a lot of legendaries and artifacts, and we have a lot of cheap creatures to recur. And Timeless Dragon is yet another plane cycling card that we can actually eternalize from the graveyard for value, or we can just reanimate it through other means. Finally, for creatures, we have Valiant Rescue, which gives us a nice little bit of value whenever we cycle stuff for the first time each turn. Moving on to sorceries, we have Akroma's Vengeance, which is a very powerful board wipe effect that can also cycle itself. It's also very powerful as well with Astral Drift and Astral Slide, because we can exile creatures and they only come back at the end of turn, so in the meantime you can feel free to wipe the board. Ascend from Avernus provides a mass reanimation spell as long as we sink enough mana into it, and we certainly have a lot of mana to sink in this deck. Dismantling Wave can be cycled away, but hard casting it is really good as well. We just get to destroy an artifact or enchantment for each opponent. Storm of Souls is a very powerful effect in this deck, particularly since we have so many ways to blink the creatures and return them to their full power and toughness. Moving on to artifacts, we have Collector's Vault, which gives us another way to put our reanimation targets into the graveyard. Commander's Sphere is worth mentioning because of its synergy with the reanimate permanent effects such as Sun Titan. Confession Dial is pretty solid, even though in the end we're not running that many legendary creatures. The Surveil effect alone is pretty good, and then it still allows us a reanimation effect. Expedition Map obviously helps us find Emeria, the Sky Ruin, and cards to copy it, and it's very nice that we can recur it with stuff like Lauren. Fluctuator is obviously excellent by reducing the cost of all of our cycling cards. Lightning Greaves is there to protect our big bombs. Portal of Phyrexia is a really powerful reanimation effect that our opponents are going to have to answer, and when they do, we just get to bring it back with something like Lauren for immense value. For enchantments, we have Astral Drift and Astral Slide. These are both very similar. They're two of the best cards in the deck, and we want to search them up as often as we can. We're also running the Restoration of a Ganjo, which is another historic card that we can discard to our commander, but this card is just very decent value, and it has a mini reanimation effect stapled onto it as well. Moving on to lands, we're running a Ganjo, which we can use for its channel effect, and then reanimate with a number of different cards. Emeria is obviously really powerful if we get to the late game by allowing us to recur a creature every turn. Gaia Reach Sanitarium can fill up our graveyard whilst providing us a bit of card selection, which is always nice. Inventor's Fair is strong because it can search up some important cards in the deck, such as Fluctuator. Nykthos is obviously very powerful in any monocolored deck, such as this one. Thespian's Stage is really strong because it can copy Emeria, which for some reason is not a legendary land. And finally, War Room is a nice little way to draw some extra cards if we're ever stuck without any action. So there you have it. That has been our Joe Grant deck tech. What do you think about this one? Are there any cards that you would have added? Any things you think that I missed? Let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.